I'm John Shattuck, and I'm a professor of practice in diplomacy at the Fletcher School. I want to tell you a little bit about the course that I will be offering this fall on U.S.-EU relations in the 21st century. It's a flagship course offered jointly between the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium, and the Fletcher School for a joint degree in transatlantic affairs. And those students who are in this degree program are required to take the course, but we welcome other Fletcher students and would be delighted to have you join us. It's a highly interactive course, combines theory and practice. It's really about the evolving relationship between Europe and the United States at this critical moment in history, with all the things that are going on, the war in Ukraine, of course, the centrifugal forces in Europe, Brexit, populism and nationalism, and certainly the challenges in the United States to democracy and all of the various elements that relate to democratic governance. So it will be taught by an all-star transatlantic faculty of Europeans and Americans. I will be organizing and teaching all aspects of the course. We combine theory and practice, which is really consistent with my own background as a diplomat, a former university president at Central European University in Budapest, a human rights lawyer, and an international affairs professor. I have a lot of experience in diplomacy, ending the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, protecting academic freedom from authoritarianism in Hungary. So it will be quite a ride, and I think you'll find it very interesting if you sign up to participate. So what exactly is this transatlantic relationship that we'll be studying? Well, until Trump and Brexit, in the UK, it was often taken for granted, like a comfortable old shoe. The relationship between the US as the new partner and Europe as the old partner was rarely examined except for particular aspects like NATO until recently. But now with Russia's attack on Ukraine, it's become more important than ever. But with Trump and Brexit and Viktor Orban in Hungary, the transatlantic relationship is under stress, greater than at any other time since the end of the Cold War. There are really three alternative visions of transatlantic relations. There's the vision of coordination, which has been brought into reality through trade agreements of various kinds. There's the vision of combination, where, in fact, the US and Europe actually do things jointly, such as the military support of Ukraine, which has been a very great success of combination. And then integration, the only example of which brings the two entities on both sides of the Atlantic together, the NATO command structure is probably the best example of that. There's a whole web of historical transatlantic connections, of course, the World War II alliance against fascism, the Cold War containment of the Soviet Union, the world's largest trading partnership, US and Europe working together, shared values of democracy and human rights, and indeed the transatlantic relationship has been the driving force behind institutions of international order that were created after World War II. NATO, the EU, the UN, the World Bank, IMF, the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And this entire framework is now under siege from multiple directions, from technology, globalization, insecurity, nationalism, populism, xenophobia, culture wars, and indeed most recently the COVID pandemic, to say nothing of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So many questions exist today about the US-EU relationship in light of these centrifugal forces. The biggest question is how adaptable and resilient is this relationship that has meant so much in the past? How can it deal together with the rest of the world with the great transnational issues like climate change and nuclear weapons and terrorism? How vital is how much continued vitality is there of the core transatlantic values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law? And the biggest question of all is whether all the disruptive change that we see today can be a catalyst for reform, strengthening of the transatlantic relationship, or indeed, on the other extreme, disintegration. So what we will do, there are a number of areas that I'd like to quickly outline that the course will take up. Certainly it will look at history. This is all laid out in the syllabus, 5 broad areas: history, law, politics, economics, and security. We'll look first at the post-war seeds of European integration, the Yalta Conference in 1945, the origins of the Cold War. And then we'll look at sort of comparative legal structures between the US and the EU, and how legal structures for transatlantic relations work. And we'll have, as one of our first real practical efforts to explore this issue, we'll have a debate about the differing US and EU federal systems and how they can effectively coordinate policy responses to climate change. We'll look very specifically at climate change in this regard. We'll then take up politics, both the external and internal politics of the transatlantic relationship, looking first at what I call the post-war Cold War forces of disintegration, failed states, human rights crises, mass migration, the rise of ethnic and religious conflict and terrorism in places like Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, then of course 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. How has the transatlantic world dealt with these issues as an entity? We know what the policies of the various components are, but how as an entity? We'll then have a policy debate about what the leading transatlantic institution should have done about Syria, for example, in 2015, when the Syrian crisis was getting very severe, but the Russians had not yet intervened. And we'll have a policy debate about that. We'll also look at the issues of mass migration as a result of these forces of disintegration and the impact on European politics. We'll then look at the second big political issue, which is the populist, nationalist, and authoritarian threats to liberal democracy in the US and Europe, which are going on right now. The backlash against the post-Cold War elite consensus about market economics and EU consolidation and a culture of diversity. We'll look at the populist nationalist revolt in the United States, of the Tea Party, of Trump, in Europe, of Brexit, of Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Marine Le Pen in France. And we'll have a policy debate about the EU sanctions against Hungary for violating EU rule of law norms, which is a topic that's of great importance even right as we speak. Then we'll take up as our fourth area, economics. We'll look at the financial and economic crises of 2008 and 9 and the most recent crises that are continuing of 2020 and 22. The causes of these various economic crises and their impact both politically and economically. And we'll look very specifically in our policy debate at the pandemic shutdown in the 2020 economic crisis and the comparative US and EU responses to the pandemic from an economic standpoint. Then we'll look at the US-EU relationship on trade and regulatory affairs, and we'll do a case study of how the EU and the US are addressing issues both together or separately and differently of artificial intelligence and privacy regulation. We'll look at the tensions over China policy in the economic sphere. And then the final area we'll look at is the security issues. Above all, Russia and Ukraine, the factors that have shaped the different perspectives of Russia, the EU, and the US, different narratives since the end of the Cold War, the origins of Russia's attack on Ukraine, and we'll have a huge policy debate about how the transatlantic partners should respond to Russian aggression even as we speak, which will be continuing, of course, during the course of the fall discussions. Then we'll look finally at NATO and the future of the transatlantic cooperation, the rationale and structure of NATO and the NATO enlargement and the impact of NATO enlargement, issues of burden sharing, and finally the future of the transatlantic alliance. Well, let me conclude with just a few comments about how we will conduct the course. As I say, this will be a highly interactive course. We'll have students in the College of Europe as well as in Fletcher. We'll be working with interactive videos, so in that sense it'll be a hybrid course, even though it'll also be in person in both places. It's a very participatory course. We want all students to actively engage in discussions and debate. The reading will reflect both European and US perspectives. And the writing assignments will all essentially revolve around the concept of a policy brief. How do you write a policy brief for decision makers? And we're going to be effectively looking at decision makers and the decisions that they made and recommendations that students will make about those decisions in each of the policy debates that we will have. So this is an exciting course. It's truly transnational and transatlantic in its scope and its practical scope as well as its subject matter. It's a very important topic for the issues that are affecting transnational and international relations today, particularly in the transatlantic sphere. It's very multidisciplinary. It covers a lot of different fields. And I think it would benefit enormously from a rich participation by students at Fletcher in addition to those at the College of Europe. So thank you, and I hope you will sign up, and we look forward to seeing you at the first class on September 14th. Thank you, and see you there.